Right, we're going to get started. We always start on time on this show. So my name is Martin Gill. A very warm welcome to what is today our 90th Thought Leadership webinar. We've been here every Tuesday and Thursday since this pandemic started, where we've been examining a topic of central importance to the security world. And the idea of thought leadership is that what we do is we critique, analyse, pull apart subjects in order that we may better understand them. The idea is if we do that today, we get a better type of security tomorrow. With that in mind, just before we start, to let you know, we've presently got a major survey being conducted, major research study, looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on the security sector. So if you've got 10 minutes of time, please can you go to the Perpetuity Research website and fill in the questionnaire. We'd really appreciate it if you do that, just 10 minutes of your time. Right, back to today then. And today's an unusual topic. Now, we often get unusual topics on this webinar series, and it's come about actually out of interest because people have been asking about ways of improving performance. And it was actually a conversation in a previous webinar. I brought about this idea of mindfulness and its potential to drive performance. What are the opportunities and what are the drawbacks? And there are those who say this is a big opportunity for the security sector in particular. There are those who say it's a misuse of what it is. And there are others who say, why are we talking about mindfulness? Shouldn't we be talking about meditation more generally? Well, all of those issues are likely to crop up with the panel we've got today. They're from different parts of the world, and they're experts in different aspects of this issue. So what I'm going to do in a second is once again invite them to introduce themselves. And once each of them have done that, we'll then invite them to make their opening statement. Once they've done that, we'll come to you, the audience, for your questions. So do get your questions in early using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to incorporate your questions in the discussion. So without further ado then, let's ask our panel to introduce themselves. Let's first of all go to the Isle of Man and Rodney.
Thanks, Martin, appreciate it. So I'm Rodney King. I'm mostly known in the world of self-preservation training, but as a social scientist, my focus was in mindfulness and its relationship to leadership performance. In the security world, I run a program entitled Strategic Mindfulness for Security Professionals.
Thank you very much indeed. And from the Isle of Man to Sussex, and Becky.
Hi everyone, my name is Becky. I have been a coach, a meditation teacher for 10 plus years now. I also do learning experiences with horses. And my connection to security is I am married to a cybersecurity professional.
Do you know, Becky, I didn't know that. And then all the way over to California and Christian.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Christian De Quincey. My focus of interest is the relationship between mind and body in particular. And by embodiment, I don't just mean the human body, I mean interspecies bodies, but also the larger question of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. What is the nature of consciousness and what is the nature of energy and matter? So that's the perspective that I come from. And I will be viewing and hearing and listening and responding to the points made in this session from that perspective, from that context.
Christian, thank you very much indeed. Well, as you can see, once again, an expert panel. Many of you, the audience, write to me from around the world and say, don't we get expert panelists? And as you can see, we've done it again, very different takes on the issue. So without further ado, then we'll go to each of our panelists and we'll ask them for their opening statements. 3 minutes for them to say whatever they want to say about this topic. Rodney, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Martin. So I just want to situate my interest in mindfulness as a state of being in the moment of performing at one's best. The truth is there is no clear consensus on how mindfulness is defined. But if one takes a purely secular approach to mindfulness, it could be considered as a state in which your focus on being aware of what you are sensing and feeling in the moment is without interpretation and judgment. So that's generally considered kind of a definition for mindfulness. The outcome of which, so the outcome of being mindful, is the ability to have a clearer picture of your inner world and how you are showing up in that moment. My concern here is that oftentimes the benefits of mindfulness in itself is overhyped. Being aware fully of how you are showing up in the moment of a crisis, for example, may be important, but that clarity, in my view, is meaningless unless you have the necessary embodied strategies and tools to harness that present sense in the service of your intended goals. This is why, in my mind, while mindfulness is important, it's an entry point into showing up with focus and a calm disposition, but in of itself requires further embodied work in that moment, including off-site practice, to allow that clarity to endure for the time that you need it. In the end, being able to free oneself from self-defeating thoughts or unhelpful emotions such as anger, along with better management of physiological changes that accompany a stressful experience, is what a mindfulness approach can offer. But it is only possible if it is accompanied by a greater understanding of self, how one shows up in a crisis, and the ability to apply embodied tools that will allow oneself to maintain such a mindful presence or disposition in action.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, plenty of good thoughts there for us to come back on. Thank you very much indeed. Without further ado, let's go to Becky. Becky, your opening statement, please.
So my question is around, are we talking about mindfulness? Are we talking about meditation in general? Often those two words are used interchangeably. I teach a different form of meditation, and so that's why I raised that question. Are we looking to be mindful? And I would argue that I live my life very mindfully. But when it comes to doing a meditation practice, I do something different. My focus point is something different. So my question is, which are we talking about when we're talking about mindfulness? And when it comes to it in the security sector, I teach meditation to corporate companies. And my experience is that if the individuals within the company aren't ready to learn, they're not ripe to hear the information, then it can have a detrimental effect in a couple of ways. One, they dismiss it and they consider it irrelevant and they don't go back to it. The other thing is that if people aren't ready and a company has encouraged them to do this exercise, and mentally they're not in a position to explore it, it can unlock difficulties and it can result in people feeling unsettled or just not ready to process what a mindfulness practice can bring up in people, or meditation can bring up in people. And so that is the question I bring, is what is the ultimate goal, what's the objective, and what safeguarding is in place when we are considering introducing this to the workplace?
Thank you very much indeed, Becky. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it from that angle. Okay, just to say to the audience, your question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. If you can get your questions in early, we'll endeavour to incorporate them within the ensuing discussion. So we'll come to you after we've heard from our third panellist. Christian, your opening statement, please.
Yes, well, as I said, I like to view this from the bigger picture of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. But specifically, as a philosopher, I'm interested in thinking, how do we think clearly about issues, about problems, about situations? And most philosophy is focused on how to think more clearly and to focus on cognitive understanding. That's fine, but I think that's only half the picture. What we also need to do is to not just think about thinking, but to be able to feel our thinking, to recognize that thinking is actually an embodied process. And part of mindfulness is to be aware of the relationship between our thoughts and our embodied feelings, and to recognize that actually feelings are more primal and more fundamental than our thinking. And the more aware we become of our feeling states, the clearer our thinking will be as a result of that. But the focus is to get away from thinking about thinking and learn to cultivate feeling our thinking in an embodied way.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. Okay, so we've got three different points of view on this. Let's start by exploring this point that you raised, Rodney. And this was an interesting one. All of you in different ways have not presented this as an unqualified good. I mean, all of you have put caveats in here. And Rodney, one of the things that you put in there was the fact that the benefits can be overhyped. There's got to be a way of, once you've understood it, responding to whatever you've come up with. Is that typically the way that it's taught? Is that implicit in most approaches to teaching on this subject matter?
Well, I think it depends on who's teaching it, right? But I mean, typically speaking, what you tend to find is, at least the way that I see it in the modern world, with mindfulness becoming so popular, it's almost as if mindfulness in of itself is a panacea for everything, right? So if you, whatever issue you have, all you have to do is be more mindful, and in some way that's going to enable you to overcome it. I don't think in of itself it does that. I think part of the discussion maybe could go in respect to this. Are we talking about a secular approach to mindfulness or a non-secular approach? Because if you're coming at it from a secular approach, then you are stripping out all the spiritual traditions that had accompanied mindfulness. And I realize why that's happened. The reason it's happened is because, you know, in the Western world, we want to make it more palatable for a wider audience. In doing that, though, we could make the argument that in of itself, it's lost a lot of the things that people say that it can do for you. Because if we look at, say, for example, the Buddhist tradition as an example, where mindfulness is an important facet of it, but not the only thing. It's part of the Eightfold Path. But mindfulness is a doorway into being aware of what you need to do in order to live a life of health, of being in a good place, life, like things like right speech, right living, all of those things are only going to be possible for you to be aware of it from a mindful perspective, because you're able to focus on what is happening on the inside and how you are reacting to situations. But typically what happens in the Western world is that's been taken completely out, and it's more just a way to manage your stress, right? It's a way to relax. That's kind of what you typically see. But I think depending on which direction you're coming from, it's a lot deeper than that.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie. Let me go to some questions then. Just when I very first invited Becky onto this panel, and I mentioned the title, the very first thing Becky came back to me was to make the distinction between mindfulness and meditation. And ironically, just before we came on air, Christian de Quincy was doing exactly the same thing. And Simon Chan's picked up on this. So Becky, let's just try and examine this. I'll come to you first, Becky, then you, Christian, for this very specific point about when we're talking about mindfulness and when we're talking about meditation, what is the difference? And why is that difference important? So Becky first, then Christian, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I have some experience of mindfulness. I've done some of the Cave Zen meditations, but I couldn't say I'm an expert on it at all. So I can't talk from that perspective, but I can talk about meditation. And for me, my favorite definition for meditation is single point focus. And so we have a choice where we put that single point focus. So in mindfulness, it might be on the breath, or it might be sensations. But with the meditation that I teach, it's actually on still silent space. So the stillness that exists beyond movement, the silence that exists beyond sound, and the space which everything exists in. So that's why I brought up the question is, which are we talking about? Because there are hundreds of different meditation practices out there. Mindfulness has got a lot of traction and has become very mainstream, and that's why it's attractive to business. But what specifically are we talking about? Are we talking about the practice of meditation, or are we talking about living mindfully?
I guess the point is, Becky, very quickly, do you feel as though we should be talking about meditation instead of mindfulness?
Yes, I think the answer to that is yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, we may well come back to this. Christian, let's just bring you in on this point, this very same point. We've discussed it briefly before we came on air, Christian. You had some thoughts yourself.
Well, yeah, I was just curious specifically to hear Becky distinguish between mindfulness and meditation. And thank you, you gave a very clear distinction. Most people tend to use the terms interchangeably. And I think objectively, what we could say is that meditation is like the larger tent, and mindfulness is a method or a form of meditation. So that's one distinction. The other is that mindfulness also tends to be something that can be engaged in anytime, anywhere. Now, I know many practitioners of meditation would say the same is true of meditation, but typically meditation involves sitting in a particular posture, or maybe walking in a particular way, whereas mindfulness is something that tends to be practiced and engaged in the moment, in whatever the circumstance might be. And in that sense, I think that the action and activity component of mindfulness would be more suited to security interests than the practice of meditation. Now, that's not to say I wouldn't also recommend meditation for people involved in security, because that's also going to give them a groundedness that will enhance their mindfulness practice.
Yeah, so Rodney, do you want to come in briefly on that? Then we'll move on.
I think what's important here is, again, we're not going to agree on a definition, but if we go back to what I stated earlier in my opening statement, as a general rule, this is what most people would define mindfulness as, right? As a state in which you focus on being aware of what you are sensing and feeling in the moment without interpretation or judgment. So for me, meditation, as Becky said, there are many different types of meditation. For example, there's loving kindness meditation, where you put yourself in a place where you extend your loving kindness to all beings. Meditation, though, when we talk in the point of mindfulness, the way that I see it is meditation is a training tool that allows mindfulness to show up more and more potentially in your everyday life. Because as Christian said, right, mindfulness is something that you are doing in the moment that you are living. So when I'm in a situation, am I able to be fully present with what I'm thinking and feeling without judgment? Because we can make the argument that most people trip up with the conversations that they have in their head. And if I'm supposed to respond to a crisis, but I'm second guessing myself in my head, that's where the disconnect, where the dissonance comes in, and that's where I can get myself into trouble. And that's where no matter how much training that I have and knowledge base that I have, it's not going to come to the forefront, because I've in essence stopped myself mentally from being able to perform. If in that moment I'm able to be present with what I'm feeling and thinking without judgment, I'm then putting myself in a position to trust my training, so to speak, or my knowledge base, and then apply what needs to be applied in the crisis that I find myself. So meditation for me is a training tool, while mindfulness is a state of being that I work towards achieving in everyday life, in everything I do. And we're talking in the security world, of course, we're talking crisis, but I can equally be mindful washing the dishes, which for anybody is something they hate doing, right? So do I spend 20 minutes cursing in my head because I have to wash the dishes? Or am I able to be fully present with the discomfort of washing the dishes without judging it? And then having that experience is going to be very different than if I spend 20 minutes in my head just hating every moment of it.
Okay, really good. Well, look, very, very good. Let's move on to some questions from the audience. There are lots of them, right? And they're good questions. So Becky, let me come to you first, then perhaps you've afterwards, Christian. Jen Eastwood is talking about the cultural resistance and how you handle resistance to learning this, Becky, and cultivate an inclusive approach, not wanting to exclude people. I think that's an interesting point, because there is this sense, Becky, in some people's eyes, this is a bit wacky. Becky, your thoughts about being inclusive, then Christian, if I could come to you afterwards. Becky.
Yeah, I think this is a great point, because I think it's incredibly important that we consider this. In fact, I was talking to a company this morning saying, how do we make this available to people? For me, it has to be an invitation. It can't be something that we enforce. It's like you wouldn't enforce a diet on employees, and you wouldn't enforce, other kind of similar things on your employees. Maybe a sports regime or something like that. So, why are we enforcing a way of sort of thinking? So for me, there has to be some responsibility for the individual, that they are choosing to participate, that they are engaged in some way, taking away perhaps some of the spiritual references that would be offensive to different religions and different cultures. I think it's an incredibly important thing to do. And it's probably why mindfulness has grown up in the way that it has, because it has taken away a lot of the spiritual references and spiritual cultures. So it makes it more of an entry point, I feel, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think I understand that. Christian, your thoughts on this being inclusive and making sure you don't outcast people. It's an important point, Christian.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think inclusivity should be just a given. But the point that Becky made is that we want to include those who want to be included. It's not something that you can enforce on people or mandate for people to do. It's like saying, I want you to make sure that you're happy and you go to sleep. This, we don't have control over it, things like that. We need to let it unfold naturally and flow naturally. One of the other distinctions, I think, between meditation and mindfulness, and of course these are generalizations, is that meditation tends to be a mode of transcending embodiment, transcending the body and entering a state of pure awareness. Whereas mindfulness is being aware of the feelings going through our bodies, what the body is doing, feeling the heart beating, the breathing. There's a much greater focus on grounding within the body in mindfulness, typically, than in meditation. That's just one distinction that is meaningful to me between those two. But in terms of inclusivity, anybody who is interested in self-development, I think, should be included, at least made this available to them as an offer. And then if they choose to participate, make them welcome.
Do you think it does suffer, Christian, from a sense of being a bit wacky?
Well, I know that the whole notion of paying attention to our own ability to pay attention, to our own consciousness, to our own awareness, people feel that that's kind of strange. And yet, if you think about it, our own consciousness is the most immediate reality that every one of us has at every moment, if we happen to pay attention. So it's kind of like the fish is unaware of the ocean it's swimming in. Most people tend to be unaware of the consciousness that we are swimming through at every moment. And so when people draw their attention to that, they kind of feel a little strange about pointing out the obvious, but it's not so obvious. And that's why the practice of meditation has been cultivated for so many thousands of years. And why mindfulness, as a variation of that, is the benefits of that in terms of reducing stress, creating awareness and reaction times and productivity. Those benefits can be accrued from mindfulness and practice.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much indeed. Rodney, let me come to you. And a question now from El Fernandez. What would you say, good question for you, Rodney, what would you say are the three main components of mindfulness in terms of security and leadership? And perhaps afterwards I'll just come to Becky in terms of her work with corporations more generally, but very specifically, Rodney, on security.
So let me ground this in practice. I think is really important. So typically, most people are not aware of how they're showing up. They're just reacting. So I can give you an example of that. Leaders are like this. Anybody that's in a crisis, we react to it. We're not fully aware of what's happening, as Christian was talking about, what's happening in the embodiment of ourselves. Having an inside look into that and then having tools to change that can be the difference between success and failure. So I'll give you a very simple example of this. When I'm faced with a stressful situation, one of the things that's going to happen is my heart rate's going to elevate. Along with that, my breathing is going to elevate too. We now know that when you are breathing incorrectly, when you're breathing too fast, that is going to affect your cognitive function. It's going to make it harder for you to have clearer thoughts. The problem is that most people are not going to be aware that that's how they're showing up in that situation. So what mindfulness does, that awareness, makes you fully aware of how you are showing up, how you are responding to certain situations. Knowing then and being able to catch yourself, for example, realizing that your breathing is going way too fast, you're then able to change it. This is what I meant earlier on, that saying, it's all in well, having mindfulness, but at the end of the day, if you don't have embodied strategies and tools to harness that present sense in the service of your intended goals, what is it? What point is it? So a quick example of that, not to go too far into it, but we have the autonomic nervous system. On the one side, we have the sympathetic nervous system. The other side is the parasympathetic nervous system. When I'm faced with a stressful event, my sympathetic nervous system, the fight and flight response, is going to engage. That's why I'm having the increased heart rate and elevated breath, and my breath is going faster. But as I said, if I don't manage it in that moment in time, it's going to affect my ability to focus on the task at hand. So what I need to do is I need to be able to regulate my breathing. The only way that I can do that is be aware of the fact that I'm not breathing correctly in the first place. That's where mindfulness is the window into my inner landscape, giving me the clue that something is going wrong. I can then modulate my breathing pattern in such a way to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which brings me back to a calm state. So that then ultimately means that I will think more clearer in that situation. And this is something that can be done in the very moment of being in a crisis situation.
Okay, really good point. Just Rodney, on that point, the question that was there was about the three most important. Did you use breathing as an example, or is that one of the most important?
No, it's an example. I don't think that you can. This is the problem: is everybody wants to quantify things, right? They want to measure everything, and some things just can't be measured. What I will say is that we all have very similar responses to stressful events. Irrespective if I'm a leader and I have to make a crucial decision, or I'm in the security industry and I find myself in a crisis. There are certain physiological changes that take place that we can all be familiar with. Things like butterflies, dry mouth, clammy hands, knees knocking together. All of these things are happening in a stressful situation. My argument is your inner state dictates your fate. How well you are able to manage your inner state is crucial. Mindfulness is the window into that. And this is the thing that I think has been forgotten in mindful practice, is that it's become very head-laden, which is quite ironic considering that we're trying to get away from the head. It's become very cognitively driven, where actually mindfulness is an embodied experience. It's all of yourself. So if in the way that I see it, as mindfulness is a tool for awareness of what is happening on the inside, so that then I can change that. But if I don't have the tools and the strategies, just mindfulness in of itself is not going to be enough. I need to know how to actually do that.
Ronnie, thank you. Becky, I want to come to you. I mean, obviously, I'm not asking you about security, but in terms of the usefulness, in terms of a corporate environment, Becky, can you sort of headline this for us? What are the key ways in which it can be useful in terms of organisational performance? Becky?
So I'm going to draw on my other experience, which is learning experiences with horses. And the reason it's relevant to this is that horses are very responsive to your emotional state. So they're very responsive to how you show up. So if you show up in a very anxious way, your heart rate is elevated, they will respond to that, and they'll look around and they're like, where's the fire? It's very visceral feedback, very instant feedback for people. And so it's another way for people to understand the importance of managing our inner state. Horses are also flight animals. So if there's anything that happens to spook them in any way, their instinct is to run. And so there's skills in, when you're learning to work with them, there's skills in how do you manage that. So important things to do is to become very grounded, to become very present, and presence is a key thing, really, I think, in what we're talking about, that sort of transcends all the different models, is really, are we present to the present moment? Are we having a relationship with that? And I don't think you learn to do that in a crisis. You practice doing that outside of crisis situations. And so that when you're in a crisis, you have that available to you. The example I give is that you go to the gym to get fit, so that when you need to run, you have that fitness within you.
Really? Okay. Excellent. We're going to get into this now. Now, Christian, I've got two questions for you, which feed into this philosophy book. I'm going to put both your way, though. The first one is from Leon Stolp. And the question is, to what extent could existing concepts, such as discipline as nurtured in the military, overlap with the philosophy of mindfulness and its application to security? Are we already doing mindfulness in some form without naming it that way? But can I also, Christian, please also bring you Glenn Kitteringham's question, which is causing a bit of a debate on chat here, is how would you distinguish between mindfulness and emotional intelligence, which consists of self-awareness and management and social awareness and management? What the audience are asking is about, are we doing this anyway by calling it by some other name, or is it different, Christian?
I think the short answer is yes. We are using different terminology to describe practices and experiences that have been part of the human species probably since we became a human species. And before that also, we have that evolutionary continuum with all other species. So nothing is new under the sun, but the practice of language, or the use of language, is to use the terminology with greater precision, so people have better understanding about the details of a situation. And so having the distinction between mindfulness and meditation can be useful to some people in certain circumstances. to many people, it doesn't really matter what you call it. I think Becky really hit the nail on the head when she spoke about presence. I mean, being present to the present moment is what's common to all of these practices. And that applies whether or not you're a Tibetan monk sitting in meditation or a security professional engaged in a crisis situation and needing to respond to the stresses within, as well as the stresses impinging on the body. And so mindfulness is very, very effective in a situation like that if it's practiced.
Yeah, I suppose it's the questions they're asking, I suppose, Christian, is that this, and it's an interesting answer. Your point is that there's more precision with meditation, and you're talking about a very specific type of thing. But you wouldn't typically put, for example, self-awareness and management and social awareness and management under the same umbrella if you were just using normal language. It's just an interesting way to think about there are ways of managing oneself, perhaps, or situations, Christian. And I'll come to
Yeah,
Rodney
and this
afterwards.
in some ways comes back to the question that was raised earlier about, why do people have this kind of negative reaction to meditation and to mindfulness? Part of the reason, as Rodney was saying, it's about learning to look inside. And when you look inside, what you see isn't always pretty, isn't always what you want to see. And so we need to learn to deal with what's called the shadow part of ourselves, as well as dealing with what we like to see within ourselves. So when we hold up that mirror, we need to be authentic about that. And the only way to be present in the moment, as Becky was talking about, is to cultivate this authenticity in the moment, to be real about what's going on. And that includes your fears and your negative emotions, as well as your strength and your power and your joy and your happiness. All of that package is what it is to be a human being. And mindfulness is, if you like, it's the language of incorporating all of that in the moment, in action.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Rodney, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't really have much more to add to that. I think Christian hit the nail on the head. I think the thing is what I said earlier on. I think where mindfulness has real potential is that it gives us a space between stimulus and response. And so what I noted earlier is that most people are showing up and they're just reacting to a situation. They're not able to be fully aware of how they're reacting to that situation. Mindfulness allows them to take an inside snapshot of how that is showing up. When you get that kind of clarity, you put yourself in a position where you can change it, and you can change it in a way that's going to be more beneficial to the outcome that you are desiring.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for those questions. Becky, Dennis Shep's got a question. Dennis is based in Canada. And he asked the question, which is a really interesting one, actually. And this I don't know if it's brilliant or not, but it comes from where I was wondering. He says, I would think that integrating mindfulness into an organization would be better facilitated by first evaluating individual personality profiles to better understand your team's capability to adapt to this concept. True or not?
I was thinking exactly that this morning, not necessarily personality profiles. I'm not a big fan of personality profiles, but I would say, yes, you need to do an individual assessment on whether it is appropriate and the right course of action for someone to go down that kind of training.
But so for some people, it might not be the right thing to do. Even if they're interested in it, it might not be the right thing to do, because there was a sense earlier we need to invite them and not impose on them. I get that, but it could be we invite them and they're still not suitable to do this.
Not so much they're not suitable. I think you need to be aware that things happen when you start to engage in these kind of practices. To use the word healing happens when we start to become more connected to our body. Stress starts to move. When we start to live more mindfully and we live in the present moment, we start to become connected. We're aware of pains, memories might come up. Things might resurface as they leave the body, as stress leaves the body. And if someone isn't prepared for that, if they haven't had sufficient awareness around that this is a very natural process and it's a very healthy process, two things can happen. People can judge the experience and say this is bad, or they can become overwhelmed with the experience. and therefore they don't actually seek the follow-on support that they require.
Rodney, have you encountered this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Becky is right. I think part of the responsibility is of the facilitator to ensure that they outline what Becky just said. And so educating people about that these things might come up and that it's a natural process is important. I think, again, in the world of mindfulness as a panacea for everything, this is something that often isn't discussed. And we don't have time to maybe go into it on this talk, but we now know that people who have just thrown themselves into silent retreats where you are just silent day in and day out, there are many times that people come out of that affected in a negative way, where they, rather than coming out of it calm, they come out in crisis. And I think part of the problem there is that they weren't educated about what this experience is, what potentially may come up, and how to deal with it, and that it's actually natural, because we can make the argument that so much of our time is lived outside of ourselves, and very few people take the time to be with themselves, and that's what mindfulness does. As Becky said, though, there are a lot of things that are going to come up, and Christian said this too, that may not be comfortable, but that's a part of growth. And if you see it that way, and it's a way of becoming better at being a human being on this planet, then that should be something that most people would be attracted to, I think.
Christian, this is sounding a little bit dangerous at some points, is it?
Well, yeah, to the extent that becoming enlightened is dangerous, because it means we have to give up all our illusions. So the danger is when people misunderstand and misapply these techniques. So for example, if people engage in meditation and they sit there furiously thinking about what's going on in their minds, that's not meditating. And I'm giving obviously a very extreme example, but the same could be true in mindfulness. If somebody is engaged in a crisis situation and instead of just getting into the flow, starts to think about, should I be mindful and how do I practice my mindfulness in this moment? And they get into thinking about it, which actually inhibits their ability to react appropriately in the situation. So the danger is the misunderstanding and the misapplication of the principles. And that's why being trained in it by trained practitioners is an important part of the applying this in any field, and of course, including security.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's move on because we're running out of time. I want to get another question. It's from Steve Goad. Becky, here's a good one for you. Does all this need a purpose, whether you call it mindfulness or meditation, does it need a purpose, being a door to achieve something beyond, or is it about noticing life in the moment without an agenda? I mean, and this gets to the root cause of what some people see as the problem. We're imposing something on this that you need an agenda, when really, originally this was about being good for yourself. Becky, I'll come to you very quickly, then straight after to Christian. If you could be brief, Becky, we're running out of time.
Yes, I think so. There's many roads to Rome, and everything you do for me should be purpose driven. What is the ultimate outcome? There are many ways to get there. So yeah, let's not get caught up on the vehicle, but let's be focused on the end destination. Sure.
Yeah, Christian?
Well, I take a slightly different approach to that. I think it's okay to set an intention, but then let it go. Because if you stay focused on achieving something, you're actually getting in the way of yourself flowing with the natural flow of your own embodiment and the relationship between your own consciousness and your mind. So I would say, be prepared to be focused and then let go of that focus. Don't hang on to it. Don't get attached to a particular result.
Okay, Ronnie, I'm going to ask you a final question. It's this webinar was partly came about through Erin Dutilier's involvement in a webinar a few weeks ago. And very briefly, Ronnie, it's quite a long question, but I'll get to the point. He says, meditation, in my opinion, focus on the aspect of nothing, emptying your mind. Mindfulness, again, in my opinion, is focusing on something. For a security expert dealing with a crisis, one must have the ability to have clear thinking on something and not nothing. So one could say mindfulness is more important to security, having the ability to deal with something with a clear understanding of your inner state and ability to handle the crisis with clarity of mind and access your knowledge-based training. Could we say meditation for a security professional is great to clear your mind when you're not in your role, but not good when you are in your role? Long-winded question, perhaps, which I wanted to read out in full, just to give you the context where he's coming from. Rodney, your thoughts, very briefly.
Well, I agree with Aaron. I think talking from a security standpoint, my number one goal is to use mindfulness as a window into what's happening on the inside, and then building off that, having embodied tools to change what is happening in the service of what you most need. And it's quite hard to answer that in a simple sense. But for example, just coming back to what I noted about breathing, if I can learn to manage my breathing properly in a crisis situation, that's going to change the way that I think, which ultimately means it's going to change the way that I react to the situation. Clearer thinking, clearer outcome. But first, before you can even get there, you need to know that physiological change has happened, and you also need to have the knowledge that it can impede on your ability to perform. So mindfulness allows you to do that. And coming back to what Christian said, I think what Christian said is great. That would be the goal in everyday life. But I would still argue the fact that once we step over to mindfulness for security, we still need tools, strategies, and tactics hinged to mindfulness as embodied practices that can be practiced offsite, like Becky said, so you can practice it offsite so that when you're actually in the situation, they come to fruition. But if not, you're still able to apply them accordingly.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're almost running out of time. I'm just going to ask for one final comment from each of you. Just to put it in perspective for you, Dennis Shep, who's been involved in many of these webinars over time, says, outstanding session and interesting tools to add to our organisation's behaviour arsenal. Please do follow up, very interesting. But I wonder whether I could just ask each of you this. If an organisation does want to get into this, be it mindfulness or meditation, what is the route to doing so? So let me come first of all to you, Becky, because what you've all done is raise potential and raise caution too, or at least put caveats on that. Becky, just 10 seconds each of you wouldn't mind. Perhaps it's a bit of a sales job for you each in terms of what you did. What's the route here? Becky?
Challenge by choice. Give your staff the opportunity and options. There are many different ways, and trust your instincts, trust your gut.
Thank you very much indeed. Rodney?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what your outcome is. If we're talking about the security industry, I think it's important to look at people that are applying it to your industry, because it's going to be specific to your roles, and it's going to obviously put you in a position that you're going to be able to perform at a better level.
Okay, Christian, the very final comment over to you, please. Your final thoughts.
Oh, was there a particular question there?
Well, yeah, I guess it was just about how you begin to take this forward if you're an organisation, given the pros and cons here. Just very briefly.
Very briefly, I would say just encourage people to trust in their own inner wisdom and find ways to help them cultivate that. Everybody wants to be their deepest, authentic self. And if every organization facilitates that, then you're going to have a richer, more effective organization.
Thank you very much indeed. Panel, thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for the questions as well. There are a lot of questions, very engaging conversation. This was a very specialist topic, actually, and we were really interested in how many people said they were interested in this, and we're going to follow up afterwards. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. A few final comments from me, if I might. Very briefly, just to let you know that the UK Outstanding Security Performance virtual awards ceremony next Thursday at 3:30. I promise you that you will not have seen an award ceremony like this before. You will see the security sector in a way, well, let me just say, be there. You need to register though, so please make sure you register. The entries for the Outstanding Security Performance Awards are still open in Nigeria and South Africa, but be aware that other countries are opening soon. Watch this space. Also to let you know that once again, we'll be back on Thursday, where the topic is responding to the growing problem of corruption. Why are we not doing better? And next week, we've got on Tuesday, digital identities, how secure are they? So more topics. We're going all the way through over to 100, all planned and in the pipeline. You can find out more on the OSPA's website. Finally, thank you once again to my panel for a really engaging conversation. Thank you once again to the audience for some outstanding, insightful questions, a really encouraging debate, and we'll definitely be returning to this in due course. Thank you to Christine and Hannah in the background, who are of course the big players for me in putting all this together. And just to say to you, I hope to see you on Thursday, if not next Tuesday, and wherever you are in the world, until we see you again, stay safe.